What I love about story time is that I can tell one story and then have several offshoots of that particular story. There is probably a massive spider diagram of Andrea Moda right in the middle, and then everything else just branching off and interconnecting. And I think there is an app where you can do an animated spider diagram. I used it at university when I was training to be a teacher, but I just can't remember what the hell it was called now. But yes, Storytime has bred several mini-series out of it. The most recent being the Downfall mini-series and the Engines from the 1990s mini-series, as well as 1994 that probably accounts for 99.7% of all the episodes I've done. Because if it could happen, it happened during 1994. But I think I'm done with that year for a bit. I think there's still at least 4 more episodes I could squeeze out of that. Not that I'm trying to milk anything, but then again, this is YouTube. But the early to mid 1990s was the era of pay drivers and mostly Italian have-a-go heroes who entered the sport with nothing more than a twinkle in their eye and delusions of being the next Ferrari, only for quite literally none of them to make it beyond the 1996 season. But that said, most of them were dead in the water by 1992, and it's only Forti that managed to stay in that long, because Forti didn't arrive on the scene until 1995, so technicalities. But Shannon or no Shannon, they'd have been done by the end of 1996 anyway. I've done the revolving door of paid drivers from the latter part of the 1994 season, and maybe at some point I'll need to do a video like the What Do These Sponsors Actually Make episode to talk about each of their very short careers in one big video, as most of them are just a footnote on the now defunct F1 Reject site. The likes of Jean-Denis Delatraz, Andrea Montermini, Luca Badoa and Taki Inui. Now, truth be told, the latter of those drivers does deserve his own episode, but I'm not doing it without using the picture of him being run over. But it's out of my price range because Alamy doesn't have it. There is a picture of him upside down at Monaco from that same year on Alamy, but it's not the picture. Maybe I need to do a fundraiser. And speaking of fundraisers, on Sunday the 9th of February 2025 I'll be doing the second of Make-A-Wish's Drive for Wishes, an 8-hour fundraising race that will see several people take about, 9 hours out of their day to raise some money for terminally ill children around the world. In 2023 I soloed the whole event in a Cadillac GTP at Le Mans, and as a whole we raised over $23,000. This year, at Road Atlanta, I've got some help from Rune and Yanis from Brabham Motorsports, and we're going to be driving a Porsche GT4. If you want to help out with donations, no matter how small or big, there's a link in the description to the Tiltify account so you can donate that way, and all the money goes straight to Make-A-Wish. Back to the video. Now, while most of these paid drivers didn't stick around very long because either the teams they were driving for ran out of money, or they themselves ran out of money, or they had too much of a reputation to ever be hired by anybody ever again, there is one driver that was around until, well, he wasn't. And whenever I mention his name, my wife will go, "Oh wow, that's a name I've not heard in forever." And that driver is Pedro Diniz. Pedro Paulo Valeros dos Santos Diniz didn't start racing until he was a bit older than most. He didn't set foot in a kart until he was 18 years old, which seems unfathomable today given how young some people are getting into racing. And with Kimi Antonelli, Jaime Alguersuari and Max Verstappen all becoming F1 drivers as teenagers, Diniz was just starting racing while they've got super licenses. I guess he's a bit like Damon Hill. Damon didn't get into a racing car of any description until 1984, which was the year Ayrton Senna, who was born in the same year, made it to Formula 1 with Tolman, and Martin Brundle did for Tyrrell, although Brundle's a year older than those two. But the thing is, when your dad is one of the richest men in Brazil and was worth over $2.6 billion US, age is just a number. Diniz Sr. was the owner of the distribution chain CBD. Not the stuff that's in that plant that Snoop Dogg likes so much, but it stands for, and oh god, the Brazilians are going to crucify me with this one, Companhia Brasileira de Distribuição. I ran it through Google Translate, had the voice play it back, and I still default to Spanish to say it. Please don't hurt me, Brazil. On top of this, Diniz Sr. was also the founder of the supermarket chain Pão de Açúcar. It translates to Sugarloaf Mountain, apparently, which is the first thing his father, Valentin Diniz, saw when he arrived in Brazil from Portugal. And in terms of market share in Brazil, Açúcar is the equivalent to the UK supermarket Tesco. With the family fortune, Diniz was able to go to the best schools and have a very comfortable upbringing. Karting initially started as a hobby, but it eventually progressed a tiny bit further, with Diniz winning the 2 hours of Sao Paulo at the age of 18. which I think is a kart event, but there's not much about it. But the company did go through a massive restructuring in the early 90s though, involving massive cuts, but they came out the other side. In 1989, it was up to Brazilian Formula Ford 1600, then to the South American Formula 3 series, and then in 1991, he arrived on the shores of Britain, driving for West Surrey Racing, who, ironically, Damon Hill once drove for in his, junior category. But also, in 1989, Diniz's dad was kidnapped by 2 Canadian students. I know. I didn't know that. And I read it and I'm like, what? It's even got its own Wikipedia page. This was all at a time when British Formula 3 was producing the next batch of talent that would rise to the top of Formula 1 and endurance racing. To do well in this series at the time was seen as being a major step on the ladder up to Formula 1, and British Formula 3 was the place to be. And by the time the early 90s rolled around, the series was firing talent out for fun. Rubens Barrichello, a fellow countryman of Pedro's, won the series in 1991 from David Coulthard, while in third place was the recently departed Gilles de Ferran. Again, I'm sorry Brazil. In just the previous 2 or 3 years to Pedro arriving in Britain, British Formula 3 had seen Mika Hakkinen, Mika Salo, Alain Menu, Ricard Rydell, Christian Fittipaldi, Peter Cox, Adrian Fernandez, Tom Christensen, Alan McNish, David Brabham and Jean Alesi pass through. And this is just me naming a bunch of people. I'm sorry if I forgot someone. It's actually quite interesting because in 1990 the Finns dominated with Salo and Hakkinen. In 1991 it was the Brazilians dominating with Ferran and also Barrichello. And I think the whole Brazilian dominance of the junior categories in Europe at that time was partly because of the Ayrton Senna effect. But what's also interesting is if you go through the 1991 entry list, there is a guy simply called Martin. Just Martin. Racing under a fake name, a bit like Jackie X. Apparently. That's just something I read somewhere. Apparently his real name is Jacques Bernard, but his dad was a motoring journalist that signed every article off with the letter X, which in French is X. So Jacques Bernard Sr. became Jacques X, and then his son, Jackie. But like I said, I need to check if that story is actually true or not. It's fun though if it is. Diniz scored just 1 single point that season, missing the final 2 rounds at Silverstone and Thruxton, and he didn't start the 3rd round at Donington for a reason. But his results saw him hovering around the top 6, which, like in Formula 1, were the points-paying positions in those days. And he seemed to do alright, considering there's at least 4 drivers ahead of him who became quite successful in 3 different forms of motorsport. Rydell won the 1998 BTCC title for reference. In 1992 he completed a season and scored 2 podiums as Gilles de Ferran went on to dominate, finishing the season with nearly double the points of Philippe Adams in 2nd place. And it is a sea of pink on the stat sheets with all those retirements. But I can't find any actual race reports, so I can't tell if it was the car breaking down or a skill issue. The first season in Formula 3000 he did 8 races of the 9 and scored no points. And Formula 3000, much like Formula 3, was a breeding ground for F1 drivers, with only 2 of the top 10 that season not making it into a Formula 1 seat of some description within the next 5 years. Diniz was the first of the non-scorers that year and also has a non-qualification next to his name. But once again, no full stat sheet seemed to be available. This was an era of multiple chassis suppliers, and if teams couldn't afford the latest and greatest chassis, then they could be in trouble. However, this year, everybody had a Reynard and some of the teams were running old DFVs. There's a little bit more going on in this time frame. The thing is, Diniz's teammate Olivier Beretta scored 20 points. In 1994 he once again did 8 races of the 9, but his team Forti wanted to make the step up to Formula 1 and do what Jordan and Pacific had done before them. And with the Diniz family being involved with the team, they were the perfect connection to have. There is some crossover here with the Forti story, and I probably should get a remake of that done at some point because it was, episode 3? Episode 4? Back in... How long have we been doing this now? 2018? But the story is the following. Forti, an Italian team, wanted to go up to Formula 1, as we've just established, but getting the funds together was going to be tricky. Forti was going to be in that tail end trio along with Pacific and Simtech for 1995 and would probably be the last team to enter the sport without some form of manufacturer or corporate backing. Stewart was backed by Ford, Lola was a sports car company, BAR was owned by a tobacco company and not just sponsored by a tobacco company, and then you got Super Aguri, which was a Honda B team. More recently, you've got Haas, which is just a moving ad board for CNC machines. Okay, maybe HRT is the last one. Forti was going up to Formula 1 just as Lotus and LaRousse had gone bust. Meanwhile, Pacific was being taken round the back of the barn and staring down the barrel of a loaded shotgun. So, Guido Forti needed some money from somewhere to make sure that his team would survive. Coincidentally, Diniz Sr. was there to help out. I explained this in the sponsor video, but I like the story so much, I'll tell you again. The majority of the sponsors on the car in 1995 were food products that were on sale in Brazilian Tesco. The more money the companies contributed to the Forti team, the better placement they'd get in Diniz Sr.'s shops, which is why Arisco, Parmalat, Sadia and all those other companies are on the cars, and Ford Brazil sponsored the engines. The very underpowered Ford ED that had so little power, Minardi paid Magneti Marelli to do something about it. And with the Diniz family footing most of the bill, Pedro was given the first seat. The other seat was taken up by some other guy, I forget his name, Bob or something. Bob, if that is his real name, and Pedro had by far the worst car on the grid. It was the only car without a flappy paddle gearbox and was the last car in Formula 1 history to use an H pattern. Not Schumacher, Prime Alonso, Prime Senna, 2015 Hamilton or Verstappen are getting points in that thing, and it was a complete write-off for this Brazilian-Italian team. The only thing going for them is that the bright yellow and blue cars with the highlighter green wheels were striking to look at. I think it was Damon or Brundle or Coulthard that said, they're called 40 because you lap them 40 times a race. There was one controversial point for Forti in that 1995 season. At the Italian Grand Prix, both cars were involved in a lap 1 pile-up, this being after David Coulthard had crashed on the formation lap of all places. Now, the general rule of thumb is give the faster driver the spare car because it's the most logical thing to do. But despite Bob being 1.2 seconds faster than Diniz in qualifying, Diniz got the spare car. I mean, he was paying for it after all. At the Australian Grand Prix that ended the season, he was oh so close to getting a point for the team in their debut season. The thing is, with all the money that Diniz had, most mid-grid teams backwards would be throwing themselves at his feet to get him to drive for them. With tobacco money and Brazilian Tesco money, the sky was the limit. And disappointed with the lack of progress at Forti, Diniz Sr. got his son in at Ligier, who had a much faster car. Even if it was a clone of the previous season's Benetton, but it had the potential to do well. It had technical support from Benetton and Tom Walkinshaw Racing, so it seemed like a good place to go. But the JS43 was hampered by a few issues. Braking was one of the problems that Panis and Diniz had to navigate around, and a string of retirements between Spain and Monza were just not fun. At only 2 of those rounds, Portugal and Suzuka, were the retirements not a mechanical issue, and all the other retirements were mostly engine or transmission related. The other notable retirement here is the famous fireball at Argentina, where a fuel valve got stuck, spraying fuel onto the hot exhaust and lighting the Ligier up. The famous "Dinner's in the oven" headline. But Pedro's finishing results were about right for the car he was in. Take away Panis' result at Monaco, which was right place, right time, but then again you have to make the most of the opportunity given. Panis scores 1 more point than Pedro did. I don't think he personally had a bad season, it's just the car was letting him down. There was also not that much expectation for him given that he'd just come from Forti, so there was some respect earned when he outqualified Panis at Hockenheim. And actually Ligier were quite fortunate because if you take away Panis' Monaco win, they actually finished behind Tyrrell on countback. So it was just the 1 season at Ligier as Pedro was moving on to his 3rd team in as many seasons. Arrows. Now Arrows was going all out for 1997, signing Damon Hill because he'd become surplus to requirements after Frank signed Frentzen in 1995. Not sacked mid-season as some think. With Damon commanding such a huge salary being the champion, somebody had to help cover that. Supermarket money might cover that. $13 million worth of it, according to reports from the time. 1997 was going to be the year where Diniz was going to show himself as someone who could mingle in the mid-pack or just be another pay driver. The Arrows A18 of 1997 did have some teething problems, first shown at the Australian Grand Prix of that year, where the 2 cars were struggling to get on the grid. Damon made it through last minute, but Pedro was outside of the 107% time. But the stewards allowed him to start because Villeneuve had gone a bit quick. Damon, meanwhile, never started the race because his car broke down on the way to the grid. Pedro then retired at the next 5 successive events. But despite this, Pedro did have his moments. He outqualified Damon at Spa and Suzuka, 2 tracks that Damon was historically pretty good at, and managed to score a 5th place at the Luxembourg Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. On top of this, he was running in third for a time at the Belgian Grand Prix before a pit stop issue dumped him down the order, but he still finished 7th, which wasn't bad for that car, and considering his reputation as a pay driver. Because of some of the things he'd been able to do that year, his reputation improved, and he had put in some strong results. 10th at Australia after starting at the back of the grid, 8th in Canada, 7th in Belgium. That sounds about right. So Arrows kept him on for 1998, where he'd be partnered with Mika Salo because Damon had moved on to Jordan. But much like 1997, finishing races was going to be hard. If it wasn't the transmission going, his rebadged Hart engine was blowing up, this being the year that Arrows bought out Brian Hart's company. His first finish was at Monaco, where he scored a single point, and then went on to finish at Montreal and Manicourt. But then the engine problems came back and he just kept on retiring, not finishing the next 3 races, but managed to survive that Belgian Grand Prix to finish 5th, which was, ironically, won by Damon. His points tally for 1998 was exactly the same as Salo's, and Salo was no slouch. But, as mentioned, finishing races was not easy. Salo finished 5 races in 1998. Diniz, 5 races. I think they're the only races that actually finished. Following the 1998 season, Diniz was then involved in a contract dispute with Arrows. Arrows claimed they had the right to keep him, but Diniz argued that the performances weren't enough to keep him. It went to the Contract Recognition Board at the FIA and it ruled in favour of Pedro, allowing him to go to Sauber where he'd already signed a contract. Arrows sued for $4 million in return, but the High Court in London found in favour of Diniz, so Walkinshaw had to pay about $500,000 in compensation. Walkinshaw appealed this, but the decision stood, and this lawsuit went on until 2002. The 1999 season seemed to be promising, because looking at his stats for that year you can see he finished in the points at almost every race he finished. All 4 of them. The car was unreliable and new teammate Alesi was incredibly critical of the car, which caused him to depart the team at the end of the 1999 season to go to Prost. Which went well. It was Sauber's worst season on record at the time, with just 5 points scored, and its finishing position often depended on how many other cars finished races. The standout moment of this season was where he was lucky to escape injury at the European Grand Prix, where his roll hoop collapsed after being flipped over on the opening lap. But Diniz stayed for the 2000 season, but once again technical issues were going to get in the way, as well as some skill issues. The most extreme of these being where he and Salo were forced out of the Brazilian Grand Prix due to problems with the rear wings. But driver error, like mentioned, was starting to creep in as well. He spun off on the opening lap of the Spanish Grand Prix and was involved in a collision with Fisichella at Austria, and then again with Alesi at Hockenheim. He scored no points for the first time since 1995, and was then moved aside for 2001 as Peter was bringing in new up-and-comer Kimi Räikkönen and McLaren Jr. Nick Heidfeld. Diniz and his family then bought into the Prost team, resulting in the Parmalat logos appearing on the car that year. But at the end of the year, the relationship had deteriorated and Prost went under, leaving Pedro with no drive beyond that. So he went back to Brazil and he now owns a dairy farm with his wife and children. He's also a partner in the supermarket business and he's also on the board of an investment company, apparently. So despite being one of these pay drivers, he seemed to do alright, considering that he hadn't started racing until he was 18, so it seemed like there was something there that wasn't able to be nurtured enough before getting into Formula 1. Maybe if he'd started racing a few years younger, he might have extracted a bit more out. But he was a mid-grid driver at best. I mean, not everybody can be Schumacher or Häkkinen, and his connections and family wealth proved to be a lifeline for teams that needed it. He would have walked into any team based off the money that he had. Privateers, that is, he wasn't going to get in at Ferrari or McLaren. But compared to some of the other notorious pay drivers of that era, he actually managed to score points. It's just that his cars let him down more often than not. So then, a look at the career of Pedro Diniz. If this has given you some insight into a driver from days gone by, then do like the video so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff from this channel, by all means get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads over at Patreon that support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help keep the lights on around here, then there will be a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Or the super thanks if you want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships for a Patreon alternative. So it's basically Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, or Sunday, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.